Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Get ready to go against the grain. We have a dynamite show to end the week for today. We'll start off with a phenomenally offensive statement by one Joe Biden on the Breakfast Club, where he basically said, "You are not black. You are not black if you don't support him over Trump." Yes, he seriously said that. I deserve your support after all. I at least pretended to march in the civil rights movement. Bernie Sanders wouldn't even lie about marching in the civil rights movement. At which point someone taps him on the shoulder and says, "Sir, Bernie Sanders actually marched with King." This statement is utterly and entirely outrageous. And yeah, I'm going to be pretty pissed off when we start off the segment. A little later, we'll have a friend on the show on issues of economics and monetary theory, one Steve Grumbine. We'll be discussing Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar claiming that we need to open up the economy, not for fiscal reasons, but entirely for reasons of health. If the health secretary is telling you to go risk your health isn't enough, if the health secretary telling you to go risk your health isn't enough, we'll also discuss the looming potential for an economic crash right around the corner based on inflated loans in the commercial lending market coming to a head. A little later, we'll get into some foreign policy with political news coming out of Hong Kong, Trump pushing the open skies or eliminating the open skies treaty, and Biden basically saying he'll maintain Trump's policy in Syria and Venezuela, going so far as to back Juan Guaido for president. Remember, blue no matter who. In the second hour, we'll keep the energy going with another good friend of the show, the most terrifying man alive, author, scientist, and professor emeritus of natural resources, ecology, and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona, Guy McPherson. That is indeed a mouthful. Also, it's Friday. That means the hardest segment on the network. Come at me, bro. You feel strong. There's something on your chest. This is your day. This is your hour. This is your moment to speak your piece. Keep it PG, but engagement is amply and always welcome. Bob, so let's start here. Let's start with the outrageous. Bob, I don't know if you realize this, but apparently my blackness is entirely tethered to whether or not I vote for one Joe Biden. Let's hear the clip. Let's hear Joe Biden making this stupid statement.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact I want something for my community.
Talk about being too stupid not to say the quiet part out loud. Are you fracking out of your mind? And this is outrageously offensive. I mean, just to be very, very clear, unequivocally clear, neither I nor any other African American owe you their vote. And for fracture, you are not the determining factor of blackness. It's not anyone else's responsibility to get those votes other than yours. And you get those votes, ideally, supposedly, by putting out various policies that the public and the people are attracted to. But this gets across the problem, right? Biden is basically saying, I should get your vote for free. And your blackness is tethered to whether or not you go out and vote for me. That's astonishing. And that level of decrepitness and hubris deserves to frankly lose, and certainly doesn't deserve your vote if that's the perspective that Joe Biden is getting. I don't have to give you anything, and I expect everything. By the same token, we should ask, why would Joe Biden venture to even say such a thing? Now, I am sympathetic to the history of African Americans in the Democratic Party for obvious reasons. It makes all the sense in the world that living in a fascist world where Klansmen and racists are part of your governmental system, that one of the political parties reaches out and allows a certain lengthening and expanding of your rights in the country. I get it. I entirely get it. The catch here is that your world is not a constant. Your world changes. And as your world and as your environment changes, you must be willing and able to adapt to that change and to recognize that change in order to even be able to adapt. Hillary Clinton sat listening to Mary J. Blige sing about cops, and that was enough to get 91% of the black vote. She offered nothing, and we gave her 91% of the black vote. Let's be very clear. Biden and the Democrats believe the black vote is owed because they've always, at least for the last 40, 50 years, been given the black vote for free. Understand there are consequences of an election that go beyond the people who win or lose. It also goes to the precedent that's set going forward. I understand Republicans are horrible, but is it possible that you are worsening your situation by continuously voting Democrat, blue no matter who, regardless of what the Democrat does, not because of an affirmative argument for the Democrat, but entirely in order to keep the monsters in the other party at bay? You can't tell me that you're being taken for granted if you continually incentivize you being taken for granted. Not to mention, you create the conditions that create Trump in the first place. Your blind fear-based allegiance to the Democratic Party is the very thing that undermines the Democratic Party over the course of time. Meaning, blue no matter who basically makes that Democrat getting in office that much more difficult. It seems counterintuitive, but it's perfectly true. Just because you're willing to give everything for nothing, many other blacks and people who are in poverty are waking up to the fact that you are being taken for suckers, and they've extricated themselves from the party. Most non-voters are disproportionately people of color and people making under 30,000. The Democratic Party had pushed this notion that your whiteness, white privilege, was the reason that you weren't voting for whatever random Democrat they put up. No, the reality of it is that those people are disproportionately people of color and people who are poor. You realize that it was believed at one point that Democrats would own the House of Representatives forever. Whether they could win the presidency or not, the House of Representatives was supposedly theirs. Now, you may not know this because in our timeline, the history has bounced back and forth. But the reality of it is, from 1935 to 1995, the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives only once. And that was in 1947 to 1949, basically a blip, considering they didn't take power again until 1995 to after 1995. What happened in 95? Third wave Democrats happened. This was Bill Clinton, who basically took tons of cash and more than his opponent, actually. And in taking that cash, went on to pass one Republican agenda after the next, covered because he was a Democrat. And because he was a Democrat, they basically allowed him to do this right-wing stuff. So passing NAFTA, destruction of Glass-Steagall, destruction of welfare, deregulation of the telecommunications industry, exploding the prison population. And by the way, on that one, enshrining the disparity in regards to sentences between blacks and whites, knowingly doing so. Meaning they understood that crack and cocaine were pretty much the same substance, but they still had different, vastly different criminal sentences. Whites tended to use cocaine, it was more expensive. Blacks tended to use crack. Joe Biden, Bill Clinton knew that that was in that bill, and they pushed that through regardless. The House, after 95, with New Deal or third wave Democrats, at that point, was up for grabs. Whereas the public started to realize that the Democratic Party had abandoned any notion of working for the poor and the middle class under the basic mantra of you have nowhere else to go, we don't have to do anything for blacks, Hispanics, the poor, because they basically have nowhere else to go. It's a two-party system. Those guys are monsters. We just need to be least worst. We can forever be relative to whatever the Republican Party is without having any real core of policy integrity to make us distinct into what we are, because people are basically just terrified of Republicans. This has been a recipe for disaster, especially for people with a real desire to get policy accomplished that will materially benefit their communities. We bought into this BS for the longest time. I remember going to the poll, not knowing who the Democrat was and just hitting D and going down the line. This has been a complete disaster. This cult of pragmatism, where you would just look at the narrow focus, this myopic pragmatism in regards to looking at races as distinct individual things, as opposed to things that take place over the course of time. I just showed you the House of Representatives. I gave you the information showing that the disproportionate number of people who don't vote are basically Democratic voters because they've become so disenchanted with the political system. Because despite what Democrats say, those people have come to the realization that is not what they do, or the things that they do don't materially benefit them in the way they used to. Basically, a dwindling pool of people that these guys are trying to reach for and to get. Just so we are very clear, blackness has nothing to do with whether you vote for Joe Biden. And I would make the point that Blue No Matter Who has undermined and made your situation that much weaker. How pragmatic is it if your pragmatism has ended up with Donald Trump? Bob, I was so angry at this. I mean, I don't like Joe Biden in and of itself. And I have a pet peeve of Democrats engaging with the black community as if we owe them their vote. That needs to stop big time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a few range of different things too. I guess as a white person, maybe I'll be a little less upset, and as somebody that's obviously followed Joe Biden quite closely, these type of comments aren't all that surprising. I mean, I guess you got to know your audience first of all. I know controversy sells, but why try to be controversial with a statement like this on the Breakfast Club? Like,
I don't
the
think he was
Breakfast
trying
Club,
to be controversial. I think he actually means this.
Yeah, I guess regardless if he said it or not or meant it or not, I guess it's a controversial statement.
Yeah.
And I guess that is what's interesting of it, because it is going to get national attention. It's going to have a lot of people talking at the dinner table, and a lot of people are going to be upset like yourself, where other people are going to say, what, you're going to vote Republican? So it does play into that kind of controversial approach towards understanding the black vote, which I think is very disheartening, and it's absolutely disgusting, where other people are going to say, well, no, that he's totally correct and you are true. If you vote for a Republican and you're black, then don't call yourself black. And that is a position people take, and that's obviously really disgusting, and people can monetize and capitalize on that. Candace Owens, her whole thing has been, oh, I was a Republican and people yelled at me because I was a black woman Republican. That's not right. And then people are like, well, you should have freedoms and liberties to be whatever you want. And so in a way, it almost backfires twice against Joe Biden, because one is saying that your blackness is linked to your political affiliation to a party that hasn't represented you, and then on top of it, he's also then telling you don't get a freedom of choice. We're going to tell you who to vote for, which is doubly insulting, which I think you're getting to tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean,
where the Democrats
we
go right now.
incentivize it.
I mean, I don't know what do the Democrats do when it comes to the black vote right now? They don't seemingly have a clear strategy. They're making some token hires that will seemingly do something for them to know where to buy advertisement. But again, you kind of get into this weird, complex problem where they have to have one message that speaks to white America and black America. And I've been saying this the whole time. The Democrat Party does not have that. They bled votes in urban Detroit area, which lost Michigan for them, and then in Iowa they lost a ton of rural areas, and so they don't have a unifying message. Republicans hate them, whatever you think about them. They have a unified message: smaller government back off of you, liberties, freedoms, individualism. It's a very straight message that cuts across all ages, all races, all economic stratosphere. Can adapt to that message, where the Democrats are so linked up to identity politics that they come out and say stupid things like this, Jamal, that only hurt their chances.
Yeah, it does. And, I tend to focus on the other element of that because I look at it as we incentivize it. And I get that it's a quagmire, right? It's a Chinese finger trap. It's basically you have where Republicans are monsters and the Democrats are like, okay, we're going to be least worst of this pragmatism. Missing the point that more and more people are bled out of the political process because they're sick of this pragmatism and it's not working for them. And so, they hurt themselves in this process.
Yeah, and part of it, though, too, is that, I guess white America or the Democrats have given enough power to blacks within the space. Like John Lewis, for example, has been given a ton of platform. He goes on all the mainstream media places. He gets all those special committees that he wants to be on. And so they give enough black people enough power within the system, Jamal, that it is hard to have that larger rebellion because they're able to have a stronghold on the resources. Jamal, we have a Come At Me Bro segment. I think we can revisit this topic here. If we look for somebody to fight, I'm always happy to pick a fight with Joe Biden and the Democrats. But in our first hour, we do need to get to, Jamal, we have a fascinating conversation coming up on the economy and the latest job numbers, a new U.S. whistleblower filing a claim against the Security and Exchange Commission regarding your mortgage, so tune into that, and Western media throwing a fit over China's latest moves to protect part of its country from foreign meddling. If that's not enough, don't you worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits?
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik?
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story. From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course. Come on in.
Aren't you glad you didn't say MSNBC?
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied wingman, the indefatigable Bob Schlehuber. We have a packed show for you today. If there's anything on your mind, feel free to chat, tweet, or call us at 202-521-1320. Just be aware, we're working remotely, so the engineers do have their hands full, so try not to get discouraged if they can't get to you immediately. So, last week, ProPublica published an infinitely foreseeable, but nonetheless rather disturbing piece on a whistleblower complaint to the SEC alleging that some of the world's largest banks have engaged in systemic fraud by allowing borrowers bigger loans than their true, legitimate financials would otherwise allow. Now, you have heard the story before because this is something similar that happened in 2008. Whereas in 2008, this occurred in the residential mortgage industry, the complaint charges that this is now occurring in the commercial properties, such as office buildings, apartments, and retail centers. Basically, lenders and security issuers have regularly altered financial data for commercial properties, quote unquote, without justification in order to make the property appear more valuable than it actually is, allowing the borrower to qualify for loans they would not otherwise be able to afford. These loans get packaged into pools that can exceed upwards of $1 billion and then turned into bonds and sold to investors as commercial mortgage-backed securities. The investor, the person who's buying it, is entirely unaware of the dodginess of this security because of the underlying data. Just as a reminder to explicitly connect the dots, the 2008 crash was caused by mortgages with dodgy numbers that inflated the values packaged into the securities and sold to investors who were none the wiser about the fake underlying metrics to make up the security. Beforehand, it was in the residential community. Now it is in the commercial industry. To discuss, we're joined by Steve Grumbine, founder of the nonprofit Real Progressives and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jamal. Hey, Bob. How are you all doing?
We're doing all right.
Hey, Steve. Good, man.
So, Steve, this gets into the weeds a bit, but just starting off, did I explain that correctly? And is there anything you would like to add to give additional context?
So what you said is exactly correct. The only thing I would want to tell you is very criminal action did not just start now, just like you said, it did not just start, ironically, in 2008 and 2009 either. This goes all the way back, and it probably goes back further than this even. It goes back to the savings and loan crisis with Keating and the meeting of the Keating Five, which we just passed the 33rd year anniversary of the Keating Five meeting. A gentleman named Bill Black, who many of you all probably heard of, was instrumental in bringing the Keating Five into the limelight. And, this has been a cabal, if you will. This has been a total criminal operation that has been fueled and funded and, hidden from sight, in plain sight, ironically, going back to the late 80s, early 90s, and probably even before that, if you go back to redlining in, prior to the 70s when it was ended. And so this is a huge racket, if you will. And there's a new documentary coming out here, probably in the August timeframe, called The Con. A guy named Patrick Lavelle and his partner worked with Bill Black to bring all this information out. So this discussion we're having today is very timely. It's incredibly important. It just goes to show you that we didn't learn anything from 2008 and 2009, and we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes until we bring it to an end.
Well, Steve, just to jump in there, I just want to mention one of the five there, John McCain, one of the Keating five there, and is basically praised as this great Republican mastermind, this great American hero. But yet he was part of the corruption that was fueling all of these big banks for doing what they're doing today.
The Maverick was more than a Maverick. He was a also.
So,
yeah.
So Steve, I agree with you on this, where this stuff goes back. But to be fair, this stuff is incentivized, right? I mean, you create a mechanism that allows you to basically hide things that are not necessarily great and combine it with things that might be okay, and then you basically lie about it in order for profits. I mean, basically any rule that they put in place, they're still going to do stuff like this in order to kind of grow in the direction of how they can make profits, whether or not it's, let's say, can basically fall apart or not.
Well, hold on. Let me make it even more insidious. Okay. Same people that are doing the evaluation of these properties, the same people that are doing the evaluation of the credit worthiness, the same people that are doing the evaluation of the bonds, whether they're A rated, B rated, whatever rated, same people that are doing that stuff are all tied together. It's the same people. They just change the name of the company each time. And it literally goes back countrywide, you name it. And this has been going on nonstop. So, when we stop prosecuting white-collar crime and we stop prosecuting business leaders, you think about the Obama administration, not a single one of these Wall Street criminals was ever brought to justice. Not a one of them, okay? So you think to yourself, well, shit. Excuse me, this is one of those...
Sorry, just to make sure we remind all of our listeners of our PG nature here on Radio Sputnik. Fascinating conversation, though, with Steve Grumbine. You can give us a call, 202-521-1320, if you want to get in on the conversation, 202-521-1320. Steve, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead and keep making your point.
Okay. I know, PG rated. I'm with you, brother. Right, so anyway, the fact of the matter is this is thing that regulators themselves are in on as well. This is not just the actual companies that are doing it. Like, this is an entire enterprise doing this. I mean, like, they know about this. They're investing in it. They're getting out just in time when bubbles are about to burst. It is literally a casino where they know when to get out and when to get in and make money on it hand over fist. And the people that aren't part of that gang are the ones left holding the bag in the end. And that's we, the American people.
And just to add more context to that, ProPublica did an analysis to verify the whistleblower's complaint. Now, they say the historical profits reported for some buildings were listed as much as 30% higher than the profits previously reported for the exact same building and same years when the property was being part of the earlier CMBS. A rough analogy, imagine a homeowner having stated in the mortgage application that his 2017 income was $100,000, only to claim during a later refinancing in 2017 that the income was $130,000, without acknowledging or even explaining where the $30,000 extra came from. So this is basically saying, look, all of these loans that these people are getting, you may or they may not be able to pay them back because they basically inflated their income in order to or inflated the property value in order to create leverage against the loan. Does this mean that there's a crash around the corner? I mean, if in 2008 this was caused by residential mortgages, in this case, whether it's commercial or residential, I mean, we're still in the same place of all of it at some point. House of cards is going to fall down.
Beyond words, absolutely. We just up the economy to prevent of a deadly virus, and we've instituted all these shutdown procedures. Already, the economy that was already living and dying on a gig economy and very, very fragile, already shut that down. And then on the back end of this, you've got this fraudulently inflated incomes support this debt these guys couldn't afford to begin with. Now they really have killed the economy. There's no way they can afford it. They're either going to have to do something major and buy off these bad mortgages and somehow or another underwrite them with additional guarantees, or the whole game of cards is going to come falling down. And there are ways, and we can get into this a little bit later, but there are ways to prevent each of these things from happening. Not to minimize the idea of stopping fraud before it starts, but just on the back end of this, it's not just the bad guys that are going to lose here. We all will lose. This is not a socialism in the wrong direction, if you will. This is where we all get to share in the losses of these companies. We don't get to share in the gain. So this is a real serious issue, compounded by a pandemic, compounded by laws that prevented us from discharging student loans. These are the people that own these loans for these houses that they can't afford, these businesses that they can't afford, also have insanely heavy student loans that they can't discharge either. There's all this, you said it in your last segment, Chinese finger traps, these handcuffs. The more you try and wiggle out of, the tighter it gets. And we're to a point now, they don't have too many escape hatches other than their buy up bad debt and infuse the economy with additional money to keep it from tanking. Or we're going to watch something more biblical than the last crash. And that's where my money's on, unfortunately. I think this is going to be massive amounts of death, despondency, health crisis on top of health crisis. I just don't think anybody is willing to stare in the eye. This is like akin to climate change. We're not willing to look at it. And it's going to kill us.
No, I appreciate you saying that, Stephen. Today we're talking about the future economic collapse. And in our second hour at 1 p.m., we're going to be talking about climate crisis. So here on Radio Sputnik, you will find those conversations, but you're surely obviously not finding those in mainstream media or in the degree they need to be had. Steve, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about, you had mentioned, compounded problems, especially when it comes to commercial lending and commercial properties. I mean, one instance that is fascinating to watch is the continued spiraling of WeWork and their relationship with SoftBank, who had to write down WeWork by a $6.6 billion loss this year. And it basically shows that these huge banks got into commercial real estate with no real plan to turn profit. And they just kind of kept on telling their investors, if we take more property, give more property, eventually it'll make money. And so we're seeing that collapse take place. But then we're also seeing, because of coronavirus, we were talking about, Jamara, like 40% of businesses saying they're not going to come back. And so all of a sudden you're going to have developers across this country sitting on a whole lot of commercial property. I guess maybe just tell us, what does that mean, Steve, to have a bunch of commercial properties owned by banks and developers without rentees?
What it means is that you're going to have a bunch of people this is what happens every downturn. Understand, Jamie Dimon said it, a recession's bad for everybody else, but at JP Morgan, it's really good for us. Okay? This is where venture capital is going to swoop in. Assets are evaluated at, say, $500,000. They're going to buy them for maybe 500,000. Excuse me, 500 million or something like that. You could buy them for pennies on the dollar. And this is how the rich get richer. Every single time we walk away from our assets, all business owners walk away from their assets. Everyone walks away from their assets. Somebody else buys them at a very, very, very low price. And this is how the divide in this country, the wealth divide, the extreme inequality, is exacerbated. And you're about to watch another retrenching, reshifting of the economy happen without significant infusion from the federal government. The people it'll be beyond anything you've ever dreamed of.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about buildings being sold off on pennies on the dollar. Same thing's going to happen with land. I mean, there's going to be a ton of local municipalities that will continue to sell land to get a cheap dollar, but then that land's gone forever. You don't get that money back. It's not being leased to corporations and private developers once that land is sold on the dollar. And I think we're seeing kind of a Gilded Age part 2 at the end of the 1800s. And seeing this huge transfer of wealth to even more oligarchs here in the country. We thought it wouldn't be possible, but yet here we are. We did have a caller on the line. Lori, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Hey, what's on your mind today, Lori? Thanks for calling in.
Thanks for taking my call. I like having Steve on from Real Progressive. Always a very interesting to listen to on economic issues. A little topic, but it definitely applies. And what it is that I have been sort of doing a lot of research on my own about treatments for COVID-19. And I found some information that I never hear anywhere on treatments for that disease. And there is first I heard there's a French virologist, big name in France. His name is Didier Raoult. And he did a study with like 3,000 people.
Well, wait, Lori, I don't mean to interrupt, but we wanted to get in with Steve and discuss economic matters. Are there any questions that you have on economics?
Well, here's why I feel that it applies to the conversation. The reason that we are having an economic collapse is because people are doing social distance, the economy is shut down, right?
Right.
If there were treatment that was 95% effective against this disease on the most vulnerable population to it.
Okay. Thank you, Lori. I appreciate it. So, I mean, look, even if there are treatments, I don't know if that's true or not. But even if they are, that doesn't necessarily negate social distancing. Those treatments are not going to be magically curing people overnight, which means that social distancing is still mandated, even if you had somewhat of a cure for it. The cure will still take time. Steve, so I got a question for you. In case of a collapse, I mean, basically that's what you're saying, that this is all going to come down like a house of cards. In case of that situation happening, what does that look like when we've already shed nearly 40 million jobs and people were already living paycheck to paycheck over the course of, before this even hit?
Well, it's essentially, Jamal, it's like, I guess, Jamal, just to piggyback too, like, what do we do as individuals to protect ourselves, right?
Well, no, I'm actually getting to what does the world look like in a crash like that? Meaning, considering that our environment is already in this way where all of these people have lost their jobs, what does it look like when the house of cards comes down for the commercial real estate market in the middle of already a pandemic and in the middle of something that already looks like the Great Depression?
Well, it's reset button. I mean, this is going back. We're going to revisit something that we haven't lived in our lifetime, right? We didn't live it in the 2008, 2009 because there were still businesses that were operating. There was still activity. There was still a lot of people that were leading fairly successful lives. There's still, which made it difficult for those people to relate to the people that weren't living. Well, this time, the very, very different scenario. Now, all of a sudden, white America, middle-class white America is going to experience this pinch in a way that it didn't necessarily experience it quite as bad during 08 and 09. And so now you're going to see the MAGA people. You're going to see the, middle-class Dems. You're going to see other people that you never thought were experiencing such an incredible downturn in their lives. And so this is going to bring about a whole new series of despair, if you will, from a standpoint of there is no work. It's not a matter of automation. Forget automation. Automation's not saving us here. This is a matter of without the federal government stepping in and literally breathing life back into this economy and hiring people through something like the WPA or something like what we did back under FDR. We need a federal job guarantee. Otherwise, we're going to see people without any chance of taking care of themselves. You have it already where Mitch McConnell has done 3 or 4 major things here in very short order. Number one, is stated flat out he would like to see the states file bankruptcy rather than have federal funds. Number two, you see them talking about ending the long-term additional funds for unemployment. And 3, subsequently see them also trying to cut food stamps. Each one of these items baked into the economy as what we call an automatic stabilizer. When something hits the fan, these things kick in to keep the economy from completely bottoming out. You see the Republicans and, quite frankly, some Democrats even not knowing any better. Well, I don't buy that. I think they know better. But regardless, see them literally removing. It's not safety of like individual welfare. See, this is where the theological divide kicks in. This is just a purely economic function of a normal functioning Keynesian-based economy where you have automatic stabilizers that once a certain event hits, these other things kick in. Without any kind of action of Congress, nobody has to step in. Nobody has to write a bill already there to prevent the complete and utter bottoming out of the economy. They're trying to strip away those even right now. So without fundamental understanding of automatic stabilizers, without instituting something along the lines of a federal job guarantee, without instituting emergency basic income payments to keep the lubricant in the economy going, it's going to completely tank. And there's literally not a damn thing we can do. It's going to be a self-reliant thing. This is going to become a libertarian paradise. You're going to get to see what it looks like without any kind of safety net. You're bowling without the guardrails. I mean, this is a terrifying time. And worse, you don't have the open range where you can go out there and homestead and just plant a garden. If you don't have property, you don't have a place to grow food. This is an even more tragic health issue. And to make the point that Bob was talking about, yes, they're buying up land. Guess what? Land has all the natural resources under it as well. So hypothetically, you look at this and you say, well, what is the antidote? And you would look at possibly a sort of libertarian approach, which is the land value tax, which puts a tax on unproductive land. So people that are squatting on it pay a significant amount of money for land that isn't being used for productive good for society. That is one way of dislodging that. It's one way of keeping money back into the economy and preventing these rich folk and the people that are there to capitalize on our misfortune from completely and utterly taking over.
Speaking of that for the moment, how do people protect themselves? I mean, because you're making a really good point. But basically, how does the public push back on this notion of these guys? It all tanks. And it tanks in the middle of basically a pandemic where we're already at Great Depression levels and government has basically abdicated its responsibility of engaging. So how do we, as regular people, protect ourselves in this situation?
Let me tell you some of the things that are going on. I don't want to, I'm not at liberty to give you all the details, and I'm not even going to mention the players' names. I will tell you there's two separate issues going on at the state level where people are talking about developing complementary currencies at the state level to bring about local commerce once again, to facilitate transactions with produce, with agriculture, with other local things like caring for the elderly and other needs of the local community. Those alternative currencies are being looked at in certain Midwestern and West Coast states. There's some consideration here in the East Coast, even for a few states. Other thing that's being looked at is what they call currency for the university-based currency. The universities work with the local businesses and so forth to get them to accept what amounts to be airline miles, or they have a separate party that creates basically like an airline frequent flyer mile type thing that they can exchange, and the state will accept those as tax payments at the state level. And it is another way of countering the lack of work the federal government is doing. Another action you see is public banking. And public banking is not a cure-all. In fact, it's largely not a cure for most of the big things that ail us. However, public banking is an opportunity that states, in light of the federal government not stepping in, to work with other organizations in their area to produce a means of providing loans, not to people who are creditworthy necessarily, but to people that genuinely need it. So there are some local options here that exceed the normal options we have, can help buoy an economy that the federal government has abdicated its constitutional responsibility to execute.
Steve, I'm a little curious what that process looks like, because you actually do have to control and have power. Whatever power looks like obviously will change as the pandemic goes on and people don't have access to food or resources, that you're going to see a lot of stress on the systems. But here we have Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, pushing to reopen the economy, just like many places are across the country, despite obviously horrific economic numbers. And the pandemic, in many ways, seems like it's just reaching the heartland here in Washington, D.C. The peak number wasn't supposed to come until June or July. It seems like they've effectively pushed the date back enough that they were able to get ahead of the virus. We're at 11 days here in Washington, D.C. of seeing a decline in new cases. And it was the mayor saying that it wasn't going to be until 14 days did the economy start to reopen in its different phases. But I'm somebody that's pushed for a public bank here in Washington, D.C. for a long time. It is really disgusting that the D.C. government takes its money and puts it in private banks that are able to lend it out and get interest off of our taxpayer dollars, as opposed to having a public bank that could control that and do more unique lending. That stuff hasn't happened, and it surely wasn't happening when times were normal times. And now we're in a situation where it's not as easy to protest. It's not as easy to put pressure on the system. I appreciate all these unique, innovative ideas, but what does that actually look like in process, and how does that actually get implemented?
You got to deal with state reps. You got to deal with your representatives, and people are doing this behind the scenes. Like I said, I've got my finger off of the pulse. I'm not completely on the pulse, but I had a conference call the other night with some individuals who are advanced right now and who have their tentacles in these state governments. Got very, very well-connected people. I did this and are very interested in seeing these to fruition. So, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think people are realizing, not everybody, but enough people, and I don't even know if I'd say enough people. I'd say some people are realizing this, and they're not sitting back and they're trying to make these things happen. It hasn't happened yet. So as of right now, we are PG-13 FUBAR, but we are definitely in a position where some of the people that really do understand are taking proactive measures behind the scenes to do that. The other thing is you get mutual aid and things like that, where you see local communities coming together, very similar to what the Black Panthers did. And these are opportunities that regular people work together to find a mutual aid. This is not living La Vida Loca. This is not living high on the hog. This is purely survival. It is, you're seeing groups come together, groups like DSA and others, who are leading the charge on mutual aid and things like that. So I think that there are some patchwork and Band-Aids that people are going to be able to contribute and be a part of that will provide sustenance and help people. I mean, you see folks opening up tent cities for the homeless. I mean, it's terrifying. It really is. I wish there was some great pretty picture I could paint for you. I could paint for you the right way of getting it done, but they're not listening. And so it's a real challenge. And I'm going to put this, I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to put this on we, the progressive movement, and say that we were distracted. We were chasing headlines. We were doing all sorts of other stuff that got us likes and clicks, but we were unwilling to focus on these things, because this is the same answer we had to have for the Green New Deal. This is the same answer we had to have to survive climate change prior to this. So everything that you're seeing happening now has just been completely, they poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire. And now it's just completely out of control. But these are the same answers, the same solutions that would have prevented and solved those problems are the same ones that we have to do yesterday. Now we have to do it like immediately.
Well, that's a good point, Steve. That's extremely good point. We have about a minute left, and I wanted to talk to you about Human Health and Secretary Azar. He makes the point that basically it's healthy to get back to work during a pandemic. That's an issue of health. Was it possible to basically avoid everything that's taken place in regards to the devastation of losing all of these jobs? I mean, 40 million people lost their jobs. Was it possible to take proactive economic measures in order to stem the tide of these people losing their jobs?
Absolutely. We could have immediately nationalized payroll without a blink of an eye. It would have been billions of dollars, not trillions of dollars. We could have literally kept every single working person employed, could have given them 6 months. We could have paid their entire wage and literally made sure that there's a pay act, I think, that went up $100,000. But that's just hating on the rich. We could have literally paid every salary, even the ones you don't want to see get money. okay, just to keep it going. And then give us a chance to properly handle a pandemic, properly handle ensuring that we get things right, and buy us some time. We could have literally insured every business for 6 months. We could have provided them with revenue insurance, even though that would rub progressives and others the wrong way. The idea here is not to take this opportunity to punish someone, but to ensure that we make the proper choices in the right fashion and survive while we have a life and death struggle going that we shouldn't have to balance between. Families shouldn't have to choose whether they want to die or eat by going to work where people are not wearing face masks properly, not washing their hands properly, going out and partying at the club and then coming to work and bringing the disease with them. People shouldn't have to make that.
1,000% agree. 1,000% agree. We have one caller on the line. Adam, we have about 20 seconds. How's it going?
Not too bad. I was going to challenge the libertarian view on taxation. Instead, what that would actually do is force the sale of properties, which the only people that currently have money are the largest corporations, which got the largest bailout from the Fed. So all you would be doing is an upward concentration by trying to create the productive use of that land rather than actually distributing the land to others. It actually would not work in the way you said, Steve.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. Steve, we got about 20 seconds before we outro. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just say the land value tax, it's all in the details. How you do that, whether you want to distribute that land, however you want to do it, I would leave that to the local community side on that is that he's right. I mean, you can structure a really bad program or you can structure a really good one. And he's absolutely right. If you take it the way he said it, it's absolutely exactly the wrong way of doing it. So we have no beef there. We're in 100% agreement.
We're a vegan-friendly show here. No beef amongst our callers and our guests. Steve Grumbine, thank you so much for joining us, founder of the nonprofit Real Progressives and the host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. Steve, where can people find more of your work online?
That's it, macroandcheese.com. They can find us at Real Progressives and my other 501c4 nonprofit, which is Real Progress in Action. Both of them are on Facebook. Both of them are on YouTube. And we're about to re-up our website here very shortly. So look for us there as well.
Very cool. Greatly appreciated. With that, we turn to a quick break before turning our attention to China, Syria, and the open skies. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. We close out our Friday, May 22nd show here. We continue through until 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We close out the week today with the show. We were talking about the U.S. and global economy. We talk now to some geopolitics and global meddling there in regards to China and Hong Kong. If you have any thoughts on that or anything you've heard today, give us a call, 202-521-1320. Jamar, lots of uproar today in Western media, to say the least, over China's National People's Congress allegedly planning to introduce a national security and anti-sedition law on Hong Kong's behalf, bypassing Hong Kong's legislator via a rarely used constitutional backdoor. The bill comes in response to last year's mass anti-government protests over a very controversial extradition law. Details are thin, as the law has yet to be drafted, but any law allegedly would make criminal any of the following: secession, breaking away from the country; subversion, undermining the power or authority of the central government; terrorism, using violence or intimidation against people; and activities by foreign forces that interfere in Hong Kong. Western media, Jamal, and the U.S. government took the opportunity to seize on this news to do some good old China bashing. From the New York Times, it reads, "The freedoms that have distinguished Hong Kong from the mainland, like an unfettered judiciary and freedom of assembly, have helped the former British colony prosper as a global city of commerce and capital. But the proposal raised the possibility that Beijing government would damage the one country, two systems policy that has ensured such liberties, such as the territory was reclaimed by China." Jamal, if it wasn't for the Brits colonizing the underdeveloped and ignorant Chinese people, they never would have had the freedoms and liberties they do today. I love the New York Times framing it as if like the colony was so great until the Chinese took it back over. Other headlines in the media: NBC News, Hong Kong lawmaker mourns end of homeland as China mulls anti-protest law. And Vox has, quote, "It's an official death sentence for Hong Kong. China moves to pass national security law." As for the U.S. government, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Friday condemned China's push for legislation allowing it to exercise more control over Hong Kong, saying such a move would be a death knell for the territory's autonomy from Beijing. Pompeo said this morning, quote, "The United States strongly urges Beijing to reconsider its disastrous proposal, abide by its international obligations, and respect Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, democratic institutions, and civil liberties, which are key to preserving its special status under U.S. law." The law is not set in stone yet, and we'll cover more of that next week in depth when it does become law, if it becomes law. But for now, I want to point out a few things, Jamar, regarding the coverage of what's taking place. First of all, Americans. There is no comparison here to level of meddling taking place in Chinese and Hong Kong affairs right now. But let me go down the stupidity of Russiagate. Say at one time in our history, Russia came and colonized America, and then America fought back to win control over their territory. And then a few decades later, Russia began meddling in our elections and social policies, and people started bringing Russian flags to rallies. Could you imagine, Jamal, people freaking out? Here in this country, people have freaked out around the near idea of Russian meddling without them actually having done anything. And now you have the former colonizer, the Brits and Western America at the back, pushing global messaging to weaken China's credibility over its own territory. The hypocrisy and the outrage. I'm telling you, go to any U.S. rally and bring a big Russian flag and see if people are okay with it. But here we are as outsiders looking in on Hong Kong and saying, wave your American flags, wave your British flags, meddle away. Who in the world are we to think that a country like China wouldn't have a problem with countries meddling, especially former colonial rulers of their people and their land? Second, Jamar, the level of protest in Hong Kong are quite interesting to me, and the coverage and the support given to them by liberals. Could you find anybody here in the United States that would be okay with protesters smashing windows, setting different police stations on fire, throwing Molotov cocktails, breaking in the U.S. legislature, and spray painting on the walls? Could you imagine? But it's always fascinating to me, this complete blanket of support given by American liberals to the Hong Kongers that are there protesting. And finally, Jamar, my last point here, the lack of coverage whatsoever towards the economic grievances of the protesters is absurd and extremely telling that at the end of the day, the New York Times do not really care about the material conditions of Hong Kongers. They only care about pushing a hardline anti-China sentiment. Jamal, I was in Hong Kong to cover the protest last year, and that was one of the most undercovered stories. There was two. One, there was people that were pro-China because they lived in China that were basically saying, look, Hong Kong would have always been part of China if it was not for the Brits and their opioid wars, basically pushing this drug on our people and then financially extorting us. So no, we're not okay with the Brits. No, we do not want to be an autonomous region. We're cool. We'll be loving to be connected with our families that are on the mainland and have that freedom of travel. And the second one, Jamar, the Gini coefficient in Hong Kong is one of the highest in the world, which is the economic inequality between the wealthiest and the poorest people. We talked to so many teachers, so many young people that did not want to work in the financial industry. And they said, look, I can't be a teacher and afford property here. What can I possibly do? But those class grievances, they're not covered in Western media because Western media does not cover class grievances of those that live in the West here in the United States. So surely they're not going to talk about class divisions there in China whatsoever. But here we have, again, foaming at the mouth is the Western media coverage towards Hong Kong.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpackage there, and I 1,000% agree with you, Bob. There's a few points, right? So you're right. If the United States had been invaded by Russia, oftentimes what we don't know or what we don't necessarily engage is that the U.S. has invaded Russia along with other Western powers when they were trying to put the Tsar back in power. And on the other point to that, we even invaded in their elections when we put Yeltsin in power. I mean, Bill Clinton literally sent people in order to help Yeltsin beat the communists in that country. And so all of this stuff about Facebook and Twitter memes, when we've had a history like that, is utterly astonishing. For the China thing, I don't think Americans fully grasp and fully internalize how it would feel if somebody stole one of our countries or one of our continents, not continents, one of our territories.
States,
Yeah, so say, for example, if Russia took, I don't know, Hawaii, and in taking Hawaii, over a period of time, they give it back, like you said, after 40 years. And then, we would feel some way about that. I mean, China was basically in a position where they couldn't defend their borders and couldn't stop the Brits from going into their country, like you said, selling opium. Brits took Hong Kong after a riot or after a protest of them doing that. So now it's like after they gave Hong Kong back, Hong Kong has like this identity of its own, but entirely misses the point that colonialization was not a great process. I mean, they need to go to Egypt, or they need to go to Kenya and go to some of those museums where you could see some of the rules that Britain put in place during this idea of colonialization. The same thing was true in Hong Kong. So it's like they give this stuff a blank slate. And you're right, they don't even talk about the class differences or the class grievances. They talk about this as if these guys who are setting cops on fire as being pro-democracy protesters. It's so, it's out there.
And I always remind people I don't have the right to vote in my Congress that basically takes my taxpayer dollars, which is my labor, and then directs it into military fighting. So I live in a territory within the United States. And the whole idea of the China, the whole frustration of people, what about the one country, two systems? We got to protect that. They always forget the one country. It's one China. One country means they're all part of China, but that is overlooked. Jamal, we just have a few minutes left here. I did want to just get to this other piece of news to make sure people have seen it as you speak about U.S.-Russia relations continuing to get worse and worse. President Donald J. Trump confirmed the U.S. will be exiting the Open Skies Treaty, a pact designed to reduce the military miscalculations, the risk of military miscalculations that could lead to war, and said Russia is always the problem, had promoted him to take that decision. The 1992 treaty allows member countries to conduct short notice, unarmed reconnaissance flights over other countries to collect data on their military forces and activities. It is the latest major arms control treaty that the U.S. will abandon under the Trump administration. There's 35 countries that are members to that, mostly U.S., Canada, Russia, and all of Europe. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who had clearly had a busy morning today, said nearly in his 1,000-word statement, quote, if not the value they place on the Open Skies Treaty, we would likely have exited long ago. We are not willing, however, to perpetuate the treaty's current problems of Russia engendered threat and distrust simply in order to maintain an empty facade of cooperation with Moscow. Jamal, we've got a minute and a half left. There are, like I mentioned, 35 members to this treaty, but yet again, the U.S. is unilaterally threatening to pull back from the treaty. They said within 6 months, Russia has the right to basically apologize. I don't know, they want them to apologize, write a letter to Donald Trump, whatever they think before they officially remove themselves. But not a great feel for European countries and not a great feel for global trust. And it can't feel great for those of us looking to avoid war between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, all of these people were pushing this Trump and Russia nonsense. And Donald Trump had been pulling out of one treaty after the next that for 40 years have tried to cut down on this risk of a nuclear disaster. I mean, there was a situation where one of the Russian subs had gotten an order or believed that we launched a missile strike. And the guy held the other people at gunpoint in order to prevent that sub from striking. Like, this is real issues. I mean, you're talking about two nuclear powered nations, the two that have the most nuclear weapons at the tip of, each other. And these guys are pulling out treaties that would allow a certain degree of peace, or at the very least a certain degree of time frame where they can talk to ensure that there's not an accidental strike. They're getting rid of all of those things. This, horrendous.
I mean, it's just like Donald Trump can't come up with any like new treaties, so he's like, what if we just pull out of all the treaties we're in and then we try to
Right.
re-enter them and get credit for coming up with these like landmark historical treaties? But ultimately, what we're seeing with Iran and others is people just don't want to go back to the seat. Like, why break a good thing? You're gonna break it and then try to somehow leverage that into getting a better deal out of us. You know what? Screw you, Donald Trump, and that's what a lot of the world is saying right now, especially as he continues to struggle with his coronavirus response. Jamal, with that, we are at the end of our first hour. In our second hour of news right around the corner here, we are going to talk about the environmental impacts of climate change, whether or not Amy Klobuchar will be Joe Biden's vice presidential nominee now that she is being vetted. And it's Friday, dear listeners, so time to come at our bro, Jamar Thomas. No hits to the face, though. We got to be looking good for our YouTube viewers on the Progressive Soapbox. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schillehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamar Thomas. A big shout out to the Radio Sputnik engineers for keeping us live on air, bringing you brand new shows Monday through Friday from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're not the only show they bring you on Radio Sputnik throughout the day. Every morning from 7 to 10 a.m. If you're up early Eastern Standard Time, you can check out Fault Lines. And after our show here, you have By Any Means Necessary, followed by Loud and Clear and The Critical Hour. Great shows, great friends. Stay tuned in if you're listening on 105.5 FM. If you're listening to us on the Progressive Soapbox on YouTube, make sure you like and share our feed there. You can also follow us on SputnikNews.com. And if you're not able to catch us live every day, check out any of the great podcast platforms where you listen to podcasts and search for Political Misfits and download our show daily. We got a lot to cover over the next hour here, including our weekly Come At Me Bro segment. An arrest was made in the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and the official breakup between New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and liberals about time. But we first turn our attention to climate change. Some good news and bad news out there today regarding climate change and the state of the environment. Horrific news continues to come in from eastern India and Bangladesh, where authorities have been struggling to restore road links, communication lines, and electricity after a devastating cyclone killed at least 95 people. The United Nations office in Bangladesh estimates some 10 million people were affected and some 500,000 people may have lost their homes. In the world of horrific news, there is also a new report out there that shows climate change is fueling extreme weather that lowers cancer survival rates and threatens prevention. But do not worry, not all of the news is bad, and some trends taking hold across the world. Global emissions plunged an unprecedented 17% during the coronavirus pandemic, and locally here in the U.S., renewable energy is poised to eclipse coal production. I know. I still know we're doing the oil and natural resource extraction, but we got to take the wins where you can get them. So good for renewable energy on the rise. Here to talk about all of those stories and much more is Guy McPherson, a scientist, professor emeritus of natural resources and ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona. Dr. McPherson, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity.
If I may, Guy, I want to start here with the first story I mentioned about how climate change has triggered most frequent weather disasters that will release deadly carcinogens into communities and delay access to cancer treatment. On the side of releasing carcinogens, this is much less deadly example, but Guy, the other day, I wanted to clean the ceiling fan in my bedroom as it had started to collect dust. The dust hadn't really bothered my allergies, but being a good husband, I went to clean. And while the second I went to clean the fan and started to wipe the dust off the fan, it was released into my bedroom and I started sneezing. So even though I was cleaning at that moment, I was actually triggering my allergies. Guy, take me through this very basic example and expand that to the globe and how climate change is kicking up these carcinogens into the atmosphere.
Right. So We think we're cleaning things up, and we're just throwing a bunch of pollutants around in the process. And that's the story of the human experience over the last 2,000 years, anyway. That's the story of cleaning up coal, for example. But we'll get to that later and talk about some of the negative impacts of having renewable energy eclipse coal. For now, though, we see that climate change is having a profound increase in the amount of precipitation that falls. Scientists have been saying for at least 40 years, warmer planet is a wetter planet. And we're really starting to see the impacts with the story you mentioned, hurricanes, the rise, and causing deadly pollutants to be released in the subsequent floods. Only have to look as far as Michigan to see that happening right now. How we're downriver from one of the two dams that broke. And as you well know, and as the listeners know, Dow Chemical is known for producing chemicals that have undesirable impacts for humans, including increasing the cancer rate. So you mentioned the story by the report put out by the American scientists at the American Cancer Society and Harvard University that the release of vast amounts of carcinogens is a result of hurricanes and also wildfires. But it's happening in Michigan as well. It's happening lots of places around the planet that we're not hearing about. So I'm glad you're talking about it on this show.
I am just always amazed about the lack of understanding of systems theory amongst much of our populace, that everything is so siloed and compartmentalized that we don't realize that all of these events are interconnected, and global greenhouse emissions are globally connected on all these carcinogens that are kicked up in one place in the world that affect people in other places of the world. It's hard to really kind of grapple and grasp that something that happens in India could affect something happening in Michigan, but seemingly that is what's happening. I wanted to ask you here, Guy, about an interesting kind of perspective that John Pfeffer, a guest of ours, had the other day. And, he was talking about how everyone is so focused on how Donald Trump is going to destroy the United States and destroy the world. But it was actually a virus. It was a tiny, unliving virus that was able to actually then be the thing that kind of flicked the back of the ear of America or took down the house of cards. Donald Trump obviously laid the groundwork and destabilized things much more, but it was a virus that came in and that actually triggered things. I'm curious how we look towards the environment to better understand. We look at greenhouse gases and we look at some of these things that are right in front of us, and we look at the lack of what's happening in the world, but often we don't actually look at what that kind of tipping point will look like. Obviously people were talking about the pandemic, but in a way, nobody was really expecting the pandemic to be the thing that led to the downfall. It was always Donald Trump was going to be the downfall. So I'm curious now, how do we keep an eye and be vigilant on the environment, but where should we actually be looking at, and where are the real concerns?
So that's a great question. And when I was teaching in college classrooms 30 years ago, I was talking about the consequences of a warming planet for things like infectious disease. And now we're starting to see those kinds of things play out. And it's very undesirable. I'm talking about it 5 years or so. And so have a lot of other scientists, but it hasn't really crept into the news cycle until it becomes a catastrophe. And that's generally the case with scientific work, that it doesn't become well known until there's some sort of trigger event in the news that makes it well known. One of my recent peer-reviewed journal articles, published less than a month ago, is titled, "Will COVID-19 Trigger Extinction of All Life on Earth?" That's how important these little things are. Small things like viruses. They have profound impacts that scale up to us as individuals and to our entire society. So, again, I'm glad you're bringing up these topics, because it's these little things that are out there pretty much running the show in terms of providing our clean water, in terms of providing the healthy food that we have, and so on. And we just sort of took them for granted all this time. When suddenly one of them goes rogue, or suddenly there are hundreds of them released from a melting glacier, then we pay attention. And it might well be too late for paying the kind of attention we should have been paying 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Guy, welcome to the show, by the way. I appreciate the notion that we can't, like, our models have a difficult time finding all of the tangential connections that could have disastrous consequences. Sometimes these things are not necessarily directly head on. So, for example, I remember one of the research papers I was reading, I think this was maybe last year, was getting into how carbon and the increase in carbon in the atmosphere cuts down on the nutrient density of our foods, because basically carbon is inhaled, or carbon dioxide is inhaled by plants, and in inhaling carbon dioxide, it basically fills it up. It's almost like junk food. And so the nutrient density goes down. We've been seeing it take place year after year after year, but we didn't necessarily have anything connected to it. Even methane, this notion that, hey, fracking is going to be great, and then you find out that methane directly is worse. So from the standpoint of your article about will COVID be the end of the world, what did you postulate? What was the hypothesis in order to come to the conclusion that COVID might be the end of the world in regards to the way climate affects this stuff?
Right. So COVID-19 has the potential to reduce industrial activity, and it appears that that has been underway, at least regionally. If you look at China, right after COVID-19 burst onto the scene, there was a profound decrease in industrial activity. And when you do have that sort of decrease in industrial activity, most people think that's good because it clears the air and cleans the water and so on, but it also reduces what's called the aerosol masking effect, sometimes called global dimming. And BBC put out a report in 2005 that occasionally you can still find on video on your favorite platform that is about global dimming. That goes back to 2005. So we've known about this for a while, but as the scientific information, as the scientific knowledge accumulates, as with almost everything else, the situation grows worse with every new paper. And so the latest evidence indicates that as little as a 20% reduction in industrial activity will trigger very quickly 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. And that might have already happened, and we just haven't felt it yet, because we experience things like temperature increases because of what happens to plants. So if the crops fail, or if the fires burn even more trees than they're burning now, if we have entire forests wiped out, then we're going to notice. So I suspect come September, October, maybe November of this year, we're going to see declining crop production or harvest of the crops as a result of a reduction in aerosols that, oddly enough, resulted from this virus that caused a decline in industrial activity. And that's really curious because I didn't know about this thing, the aerosol masking effect, until 2012. And there are refereed journal articles, peer-reviewed papers going back to 1929 on the topic. And so it's the kind of thing that very few people know about.
Wait. Just so we're clear, what is the aerosol masking effect? Can you explain that for the audience?
Yes, I'm sorry. Got a little ahead of myself there.
You're fine.
At the same time, this is the greenhouse gases with which we're all familiar that trap heat once the planet gets heated up. At the same time industrial activity produces those greenhouse gases, it also produces aerosols. These aerosols, sometimes they're called soot, but mostly by burning coal. Coal we think is the bad guy here. By burning coal, we put up this layer in the upper atmosphere, this layer of aerosols that actually prevents sunlight from ever even striking the Earth. These aerosols act as something like umbrellas, prevent the incoming sunlight from even reaching the Earth, bouncing it back out into space. The relatively small reduction in industrial activity, we remove a whole bunch of those umbrellas, and the planet heats catastrophically, and it does so very quickly. It's the aerosol masking effect, and we're losing some of the aerosol masking. Initially regionally in places like China, then India, and then in relatively large region in Eurasia. But paradoxically, we must reduce greenhouse gases. We can't reduce the industrial activity that produces those greenhouse gases, or they'll reduce the aerosols that are protecting the planet. It's crazy. It's largely unknown, and it presents a very challenging paradox. for us going forward.
You are listening to Political Misfits here on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. We're talking about the economy here until 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then we'll have our Come At Me Bro segment. So give us a call if you want to talk about the climate catastrophes that are facing us imminently, or if you want to get on the line to challenge anything Jamal or myself have said this week, give us a call, 202-521-1320. Guy McPherson, I wanted to read and talk more about kind of this global emissions from the Washington Post. The headline here read the other day, global emissions plunged an unprecedented 17% during the coronavirus pandemic. The article goes on to talk about the impact of the global pandemic, and it quotes, here, nations worldwide experience an abrupt reduction in driving, flying, and industrial output, leading to a startling decline of more than 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. That includes a peak drop in daily emissions of 17% in early April, according to the study published in a journal, Nature Climate Change. The study projects the total emissions for 2020 will probably fall between 4 and 7% compared with last year, an unheard of drop in normal times. That's the pretty good news, but the not so great news here, a United Nations report estimated that global greenhouse gas emissions must begin falling by 7.6% each year beginning in 2020 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So even with the pandemic shutting down global travel and consumption-based economies, we will not reach the mark set out by the UN for emissions reduction. And the author of the article also does the same basic math for us, writing, even at the peak 17% decline in global emissions, which occurred in early April, it still meant nations continue to generate more than 80% of the usual carbon pollution. Guy, more good news, bad news in regards to the environment, but obviously I'm going to take the decline, but it seemingly is nowhere close to where we need to be. And we only got to this point, which is short of the point we need to be because of a pandemic.
That's right. And so, again, it's something that was forced upon us, not some decision that we made collectively as a society. Hey, let's all come together and reduce our carbon emissions. And because of the aerosol masking effect called global dimming, it's probably a good thing. There's even a 17% drop in global carbon emissions. And by the way, the Washington Post is citing a paper in Nature Climate Change. So this is a top flight peer-reviewed journal. If we have that 17% drop in global carbon emissions corresponds to a 17% drop in industrial activity, and therefore a reduction in the aerosol masking effect, we could be in real trouble because that will heat up the planet in and of itself. Not just the greenhouse gases we need to be concerned about, it's also the aerosols that go right along with them. So it's really the damned if you do, damned if you don't outcome associated. If we can't figure out how to deal with the aerosols while simultaneously dealing with greenhouse gases, I don't see a way forward. And that's why I think we are on the verge of losing habitat for Homo sapiens on planet Earth.
Now, just to dig into that a little bit, because I want the audience to fully understand where you're going with this and the severity and difficulty of this. I mean, this is somewhat of an intractable issue, at the very least by our current level of understanding. Basically, us and our normal industrial activity creates greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases basically go up into the atmosphere and create a dimming effect in regards to sunlight trying to pierce into our world. And so that dimming effect basically cuts down on the temperature of what the temperature would be if that effect wasn't necessarily there. So even though the greenhouse gases themselves are increasing the temperature of Earth, the dimming effect is to some degree cutting down on the temperature of Earth, creating a weird interplay between the two. Your point is, the moment that you stop the greenhouse gases and start going towards more, let's say, cleaner future, well, those gases leave the atmosphere, allowing for an increase in temperatures that is rather immediate, especially over the course of, talking about the way time goes, but basically almost an immediate increase in temperatures on planet Earth because those greenhouse gases went away. Did I explain that correctly?
Very close. Greenhouse gases are produced through industrial activity, and so are the aerosols. The aerosols are separate from the greenhouse gases.
I see.
So they both go along with industrial activity, and especially in coal, different particles. Greenhouse gases are things like carbon dioxide that most people are familiar with, or vapor that most people don't know is a powerful greenhouse gas, and methane, which is very powerful greenhouse gas, as you pointed out, much more powerful than. There's a lag. For example, dioxide is the best seed of those greenhouse gases, and there's about a 10-year lag from when the emission occurs for carbon dioxide and when the maximum heating associated with those particles. On the other hand, aerosols that I'm talking about, sulfates burning associated with burning high sulfur coal or unclean coal, those are the go up and immediately begin cooling the earth again, therefore not even allowing the greenhouse gases, which are also up there in the atmosphere, to act as a blanket. So we have this blanket effect from the greenhouse gases that's trapping the heat once the planet heats up. But aerosols that are up there don't even allow the planet to heat up to begin with. So if we could figure out how to compensate for the loss of aerosols that occurs very, very quickly, then we might have a chance at reducing those greenhouse gases through reduced industrial activity. When I read things like the New York Times headline says, in a first, renewable energy is poised to eclipse coal in U.S., I read that headline, I recognize the good news associated with reducing burning of coal. It comes with a bit of bad news, too. That's we're going to lose those umbrellas which prevent the Earth from heating up to begin with. This is a very thorny problem that we're facing. And because COVID-19 has led to a cleaning up of the atmosphere and therefore to a warming of various parts of the planet, it demonstrates to us that the way out is going to be very challenging. We're seeing the same thing, the Bay of Bengal in India, with falling pollution, declining pollution, leading to a profound and rapid increase in temperature within that region around India and Bangladesh. So it's a difficult problem. I don't see a way through it myself.
Well, you continue to terrify us as always, but we do love having you on here, guys. So let's continue our conversation on environmental climate change and some good news, bad news. I did want to follow up and talk more about this story around coal. The United States, according to the New York Times, is on track to produce more electricity this year from renewable power than from coal for the first time on record. New government projections show a transformation partly driven by the coronavirus pandemic with profound implications in the fight against climate change. Yeah, all right, New York Times. Profound may not be enough. The article goes on to say, as factories, retailers, restaurants, and office buildings have shut down nationwide to slow the spread of the coronavirus, demand for electricity has fallen sharply. And because coal plants often cost more to operate than gas plants or renewables, many utilities are cutting back on coal power first in response. The latest report from the Energy Information Administration estimates that America's total coal consumption will fall by nearly 1/4 this year. The coal plants are expected to provide just 19% of the nation's electricity, dropping for the first time below both nuclear power and renewable power, a category that includes wind, solar, hydroelectric dams, geothermal, and biomass. Natural gas plants, which supply 38% of the nation's power, are expected to hold their output steady thanks to low fuel prices. Guy, kind of feels like a glass half full, glass half empty situation. Renewables are on the rise, but yet natural gas holding steady is the half empty. Let's assume the water is in the proverbial cup, is drinkable. How do you see this, Guy? Is it glass half full or half empty?
Yes, it is. No, I saw a great cartoon, and there are 3 glasses of yellowish-looking liquid in cups. And they're all filled about half full. And the first one has a character beside it saying, I'm optimistic. And the second one says, I'm pessimistic. And the third one says, I think this is piss. And
yeah,
honest. And I'm looking at the same New York Times story you're looking at. It would be phenomenally great news. When I left academic service on campus and moved to an off-grid homestead, it was specifically because I had no understanding of the aerosol masking effect or global dimming. And so I lived for 10 years off-grid and grew a bunch of my own food and took care of small animals and so on, and had solar panels powering my life in a passive solar heated house, and so on. I did that for about 10 years, and then I realized that my life would be more useful if I were to re-enter the society that I had largely abandoned. And useful, I mean participating in conversations like this one that illustrate the potential downside associated with switching to renewable energy. It sounded like a great idea when I took that path in 2007, and it becomes increasingly clear as a result of the accumulating science that there's also a disadvantage associated with living in the way that I chose to live at that time. And so it's a thorny issue. I don't know how to deal with it. No fan of the temperature rising catastrophically quickly. We're already at the highest global average temperature ever on Earth with humans on it. And I don't want to see the kinds of temperature rises that are being projected for the future. And I don't know how we're going to adapt if we do see them. But on the other hand, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, finish your thought, excuse me.
On the other hand, I don't want to go halfway with the evidence that I've accumulated and present the picture that it's all going to be fine, because I don't think that it is all going to be fine.
Oh, well, I would have probably interrupted you if that's what you were going to finish your sentence with. I'm trying to have a pleasant, relaxing day, but I do appreciate the honesty. We're keeping it true here to form on Political Misfits. Jamarl Thomas, on one end, you just had me thinking about the Paris Climate Accords and how they were hopefully short of actually being able to address anything. And they were obviously rather, without actually having teeth to it, you're not going to ever get to the cuts that need to take place. It took a pandemic to get to those cuts. But I was also thinking a lot about eco-socialism. And we talk a lot on this show about how we hope there is a large economic uprising or some type of labor movement. We've seen these wonderful strikes. But obviously, what does it matter if you have a job and are being paid well if the environment around you is continuing to degrade and fall apart? And so it seems like any movement that does take hold, as much as we've been talking about political, social, and economic movements, the environment needs to be front and center, either in parallel with whatever movement's taking place or completely unified and collectively fighting together with an economic movement.
Yeah, Bob, I agree with you. I mean, it does need to be parallel. I do think that if your needs weren't being met, meaning if you were hungry or if you had a kid and wasn't able to pay your rent or wasn't able to pay your car note or pay for that kid to go on trips or whatnot, you're not going to care about the environment. You're just not. Your immediate concerns are going to take precedence. By the same token, the moment that those other things are managed, then people do start paying more attention to the notion of the environment. And so, yeah, I think any movement will require this kind of environmental piece that just goes along with whatever movement that you're going along with, even if you're taking the main thrust of it as economic, populism. But Guy, I'm curious. You said you don't necessarily think, or you can't necessarily conceive of a way out. What would be a technical solution to this, if a technical solution would be available? Like, what would it look like? What would that bit of technology be required to do in order to ameliorate these environmental issues?
I think the primary issue that should concern us at this point is the loss of aerosol masking effect that can come from reduced industrial activity, which is what we're seeing right now. And so I'm working with a scientist at Harvard and a scientist from Berkeley. And the scientist from Harvard is taking lead on this project, right, to come up with a means to compensate for loss of aerosol masking. And at this point, we have developed an idea that looks very promising. That is to use mirrors in the form of bulbs, glass bulbs, inside this very thin layer of silver paint. Thin layer to keep it inexpensive on the inside, to keep the environment from degrading the paint because it's protected by the glass on the outside. It's an enormous area that would need to be covered with these to reflect back enough sunlight to compensate for the loss of global dimming or the reduction in global dimming. It seems that it would be manageable. It seems that it is economically feasible to create these balls and build them in such a way, and I'm not an engineer here, so I'm going to try to use engineering language and not get myself far caught up in things that I don't know. but it seems that we can create a system that has two stable states with the balls. One stable state has them full of water, seawater, for example, and that allows them to sink down 30 meters or so that ocean traffic can go over the top of them without damaging them. But then most of the time they're at the surface. The sunlight strikes them and is reflected back into space. We know the wattage of sunlight that is striking the planet right now, so we know how much to reflect back out to compensate for the loss of aerosol masking. So that's what I'm working on right now with primarily a guy named Ye Tao at Harvard, and a few other people are joining the party as well. So it looks reasonably promising, at least on paper, but as we all know, there's no difference between theory and practice, at least in theory. In practice, there might well be a difference between theory and practice. So that's where we are at this point.
Yeah, and just a final question, Guy McPherson. I just remember about 10 years ago asking a lot of people when I got really into climate change and understanding the environment and the unique opportunities or innovations that would be needed. So it's fascinating to hear what you're talking about. I hope we can have you back on to tell us a little bit more about that work. I'm curious, though, is what's going to make the changes? Is it economics that are going to make renewables cheap enough where people just simply look at the price that they're paying on the electric bill at the end of the day? That's going to start moving people, and that's going to trigger the industrial manufacturing industry to start developing more windmills or the type of programs you're talking about. Is it more political that we do have the right Green New Deal that catches on in the populace and that's the big movement that takes hold, or is it just going to be people simply being impacted by climate change and there's a large social movement? Where has the movements been the last few years that have gotten to this point where renewables are finally catching up with coal, and where do you think the movements need to go from here?
Well, I think it's going to have to be a case of all of the above. We're going to have to be able to make significant changes in our lives. We're going to have to be able to sacrifice something along the way. We're going as individuals and therefore as a society. In World War II, the American automobile manufacturers shut down production for a couple of years so that they could provide production for the military. And nearly half of the food that was grown in the United States was grown in people's individual gardens in their own yards. They were called victory gardens. I don't hear anybody today asking Americans to make a sacrifice. I don't hear anybody asking people of the world to make a sacrifice. And we continue to produce more than 25% of the greenhouse gases, more than 25% of the pollution with less than 5% of the world's population. If anybody's going to set an example, it's going to have to be us. This is what I was trying to do when I left active service and moved off grid and started living very differently. And that to be a very expensive proposition. And it's the kind of thing that if we get society involved, it'll go much more smoothly than if it's just one or two scientists here and there that, and because they're scientists, people look at them a little funny anyway. So it's going to require societal level response, definitely far greater than the Manhattan Project. And it's going to have to come from leadership at the highest level and also leadership in the communities.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're listening, go do something, go organize, act now, go start and plant your victory garden. Might be too soon to plant the victory garden in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic continuing to peak, but at least plant whatever garden you want, and we'll call it a victory garden, hopefully one day when we get there. With that, we are unfortunately out of time with Dr. Guy McPherson, who is a scientist, professor emeritus of natural resources and ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona. Guy, if people want to find more of your work online and follow you, where can they do that?
McPherson.com is where this interview will be archived in the not too distant future, and that's where I put all of my work. So find me at GuyMcPherson.com. And thank you very much, both of you, Jamal and Bob. I appreciate the opportunity to chat again.
Please, thank you. The honor is all ours. We do turn to a break now. After the break, we take on our favorite bro, Jamal Thomas, in our weekly Come At Me Bro segment. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Jamal, I know DJ, one of our favorite callers, is already lined up. I hope he's coming at you. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. You hear that sound, you hear that noise. It is indeed Friday. Come at me, bro! The hardest segment on the network. We are absolutely appreciative of your calls, your engagements. If you have chats, tweets, or for that matter, call in 202-521-1320 if you have something on your chest or if you have something on your mind. Apparently, we already have a caller. DJ, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going, Jamal? How's it going, Bob? I came across something I came across something that was interesting, and it's going back to the HR 6666 conversation, where it wasn't you, multiple people that said that they see nothing in the bill about vaccination. And that's what I'm coming at you about, because while that's technically true,
let me explain to the audience what we're talking about, because they may not necessarily know. This gets slightly in the weeds. There was a piece of legislation, I think by Congressman Rush, about track, trace, in order to open the economy and keep track of people who have COVID-19. It's a piece of legislation, a standalone piece of legislation that Rush was backing, that a lot of people started having a bit of consternation about because they thought it exceeded or went too far. So go ahead, DJ. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, let me just wanted to read here from the bill since I just have it pulled up. It says to authorize the Secretary of Health and Human Services to award grants to eligible entities to conduct diagnostic testing for COVID-19 and related activities such as contact tracing through mobile health units and, as necessary, at individual residences for other purposes. No vaccine mentioned in a quick search there of the bill, though.
Okay, and you actually just read that mention of the vaccine. So what you read was Section 2, Section 2, Item A, Section 2, Item 2. And when you're saying, as necessary, testing individuals and providing individuals with services related to testing and quarantine at the residence. So the related to portion. It goes, that's the important thing. You know, there's that ambiguous language. That's not ambiguous. That's just a very broad scope. What would be related to testing? It would be vaccination. It would be some sort of immunization. And then it actually
But DJ, you'd agree
to,
with me that nothing is forced. I mean, there's nothing in the bill that requires vaccinations or, for that matter, even requires testing. All of this stuff is voluntary.
No, and that part I do agree with. I do agree with that. I was just speaking to the fact that, you know, people are saying, well, there's no mention of vaccines in there. It's like, well, if I said that I was hungry and I was going to, you know, satisfy my hunger, you could say he didn't say he was going to eat, right? Yeah. I'm not necessarily the words. It's in the language. So whenever they say anything related to a vaccination, okay, we don't want you to get it, so we're going to immunize you. Well, you have this, we're going to vaccinate you. The thing that's concerning about that to me is that initially they were saying, well, it's going to be 1 year to 2 years before we have the vaccine. And also in that same bill in Section D, when they talk about the distribution, it says, in selecting grant recipients under this section, the Secretary shall ensure that grants are distributed across urban and rural areas. So they're distributing the grants to those areas, and they're going to people who are actually getting the vaccinations out. Those are the people that are targeted. Concerns me is these are typically socioeconomically, you know, they're not the par, those sort of people, you're targeting, in most cases, disenfranchised groups. And for a vaccination that previously we were saying would take up to 2 years to be done, there's that. I just think about that broad language. Yeah. I'm constantly reminded of the Patriot Act, where it's like, okay, 2001, we have to prevent terrorism. In 2011, 1,618 times the Patriot Act was used. It was for drug cases and only 15 times for terrorism. And now today, or excuse me, 2020, we have an expansion. Along with this bill right here, where we're talking about tracing people, and there's an expansion of powers to view people's browser history. Yes. So it looks like they're going to be doing this. And even though you may say it's not voluntary, not you, I'm just saying the bill, it's easy. Okay, well, these people who live in urban and rural areas, most of these people may be on welfare. They may have benefits of Social Security. And if you don't take this, well, it's not voluntary. We recommend you take this so we can, it could be a preventative.
So, DJ, I don't misunderstand me. I agree with you. And I think when I did the video on this, I postulated that governments, especially when they pass legislation, and they're not specific in that legislation, other governments come behind them and use it for ways that wasn't necessarily intended for its use. For example, the war on terror. I mean, George Bush puts through a bill where it authorizes military action in Iraq. Obama uses that bill in order to try to topple Syria and topple Libya, have nothing to do with each other. And so I agree with you that there's always a push or an extension of trying to use pieces of legislation and pieces of policy to get political objectives accomplished. I mean, look at what Trump did. Trump called a national emergency something that had been in law for God knows how long, and then used it to try to build a wall. My issue here, though, is that basically if you're indeed trying to get a piece of legislation passed in order to deal with testing, tracking, tracing, how do you do it? And don't you need something like this in order to make that work? Let me bring in Bob. Bob, do you agree or disagree with this one? You've read the bill yourself at this point, or at the very least have the gist of it. Where do you come down on this? And DJ, thank you for the call. I appreciate it.
Yeah, DJ, appreciate it. As always, give us a call, 202-521-1320. You know what I mean? When DJ first started talking, I was like, nah, I disagree with DJ. I think it's talking pretty clearly about testing. That means having to set up cones for people to have proper directions to get to the tent to test up. That's a proper protect. I mean, there's all these things that go into testing itself. You have to set up phone numbers. You have to hire contract. I mean, all these different things I think is what the bill is alluding to. But yeah, once you have any type of language within a bill that's not explicitly clear, we'll list out all of those different things. I think that's kind of what DJ's saying. They're saying, and anything else could mean anything else. Well, what are those anything else? Can you please name the 30 other things within the bill that he's talking about? Yeah. So I'm going to kind of be with you, Jamar, where I'm going to hedge the bets and say, hopefully this is in good intentions to do tracing, because it's something that we absolutely need to do. But as DJ makes a good point, and it's hard to argue that anytime there's ambiguous language in a bill, somebody will take advantage of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think every time I've spoken about this, it's been, well, yeah, we have to have contact tracing. We have to have testing. I mean, we do have to quarantine certain people. We don't want those people basically saying, yeah, I'm going back to work. And so I agree with the premise where we have to be careful with that stuff. I think the issue becomes a certain degree of paranoia associated with it. And it's like, do we need, and look, maybe the simple fix is to be explicit. Ambiguity, right. I think the simple fix is just, be more explicit in regards to the language. You know what I mean? Like I agree with your points. It's just, like we said, we're hedging our bets on this. We know how governments behave. So let's go into one of our stories for today. Tara Reid.
Get him, Jamaro. Get him, Jamaro.
Tara Reid. So mainstream media has come hard at Tara Reid, with the New York Times yesterday diving into thorny questions of, quote unquote, did she fudge some stuff on her resume? And quote unquote, did she really get a bachelor's degree? Now, Politico broke this story explaining solemnly that Mrs. Reid might have misrepresented their credentials as an expert witness in domestic violence cases. Now, it turns out that this misrepresentation might not actually have gotten a bachelor's degree, even though she definitely has subsequently earned a graduate's degree in law. There's a whole complicated story about whether or not she earned the credits under a different name at a different school because she feared an abusive ex. She claims that she had done some sort of complicated transfer of credits to avoid being found out by him. Now, it must be understood that the reason that the New York Times is running with this story, and the reason that Politico is running with this story, is because these questions are intrinsically relevant to whether or not she was sexually assaulted. Oh, wait, they're not. These questions have nothing to do with whether or not a person was sexually assaulted. That just means she's a complicated person like everyone else. Let's hear the clip of Joe Biden, by the way, because Joe Biden, all of this focus on Tara Reade that the media has been focusing on misses the point that Joe Biden is a flagrant liar, proven flagrant liar. And so it's weird to me that we're judging her credibility while giving Joe Biden a blank slate. Let's hear the clip of Joe Biden basically failing out of one of the earlier elections in the 80s for lying and plagiarism.
And he exaggerated his academic record in law school.
Went back to law school and, in fact, ended up in the top half of my class.
And then there were moments like this, repeated later during the campaign.
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes.
But he never actually marched in the civil rights movement at all. Ultimately, it was accusations of plagiarism in his speeches.
I did not know that was a Robert Kennedy quote. My mistake.
That forced him to drop out of the race.
I made some mistakes.
You indeed made some mistakes. You, sir, was a flagrant liar. Your mistake, I would imagine from your standpoint, is getting caught in those lies. Joe Biden, unrepentant, basically recycled those lies for this election, talking about looking at one black person after the next saying, I was in the civil rights movement. I was in the civil rights movement. Going so far as to tell Charlamagne the God that if you're not black, if you don't vote for me, like basically your legitimacy as an African American is intrinsically linked to your vote for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden didn't get arrested in South Africa. Mandela didn't thank Joe Biden for getting arrested in South Africa. This man is a flagrant liar. He lied about Social Security. He lied about the Iraq War vote. And in this situation, we're only, the New York Times Political, these guys are looking and ripping apart Tara Reade's life for something that had absolutely nothing to do with her story about being assaulted. Bob, this is extraordinary. And this is one of the reasons that victims have a tendency to not come forward or have a difficult time forward because they don't want their lives ripped apart.
Yeah, no, I mean, and then you're like, well, how many different people are being paid to investigate her right now and have private eyes on her? You know, how many different media outlets, of course, how many salacious Republican donors, Democratic donors, all of these people tearing her life apart. And this is the one they come up with and go after. And the idea that she's held accountable to like the changes in her story that have clarified over the years, but people like Brian Williams who still have a job on the news channels, and even like his horrible math. Remember that day? What was it? It was like, if gave everybody $2,000 in America times $30 million, it would only be like $4 million, something stupid like that. But yet he continues to get to go on the national television and given a platform. So who's allowed to have, and I don't even want to say lies, but just who's allowed to have misinformation or change their stories versus who aren't. But yeah, I think finally the main point that should be taken away is like, this is why victims never come forward, or people that have experienced this trauma ever come forward, because this is how people respond. And it's everybody. It's the whole spectrum. And it's just so disgusting to see.
It is. Republicans or Democrats. It's entirely tribal politics. I mean, look at how they did Kavanaugh and how they ripped apart Ford. Well, in that case, it was Republicans. Look at how they did Anita Hill, where in that case, it was Republicans and Democrats working with Joe Biden to do so. And of course, we have now Tara Reade, which they are ripping her apart. Lucy Flores also, the woman who said Joe Biden sniffed her hair. We have pictures of Joe Biden sniffing hair. So that is not beyond the pale of belief. And yet they ripped her apart also. This is disturbing, especially after the Me Too movement. Here's a question. Did the Me Too movement get real political gains if this is what's taking place right now from the standpoint of Kavanaugh and from the standpoint of Ford and from the standpoint of Reade and Flores?
Do they what? Political gains?
Did the Me Too movement, was the Me Too movement just a political device in order to use to attack Trump? Meaning once it was appropriated, it was just used by Democrats to basically attack Trump. But the moment...
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about this where Tamara Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, I mean, like, this was never the intention of this. It was to give victims a safe place to be heard, to be seen, and just to speak up, you know? I mean, I don't even think she was necessarily even pushing for there to be convictions or justice to be found, because I think she realized that it's really hard to get justice in America. It's really hard to hold these people to account. And once that movement was co-opted, I think it was targeted at taking Harvey Weinstein down, as taking that Bill Cosby down. And these people aren't good people. Like, they needed to be taken down, and they needed to be held accountable into courtrooms. But ultimately, yeah, it was meant to serve a liberal, we care about women narrative that Hollywood loves to talk about, but yet, I mean, it's just like Call Me By Your Name was the number, I think it won the Oscar that year, which was about like an older man falling in love with a 17-year-old boy. And like, it's like, wait, Hollywood, you can't celebrate an underage sex story while at the same time trying to have this like larger Me Too conversation. It just shows the hypocrisy that once Hollywood gets a hold of any of this stuff and it becomes celebritized and it becomes on the red carpet tomorrow, that it completely falls apart. So yeah, there's no political gain to be had right now. It's falling apart. It's demonizing victims again, and we're kind of back at square one, which is so sad and terrifying. Jamal, we do just have a minute left here. I know you fell asleep when you were writing the story here for the script. I did want to know if you think of Amy Klobuchar as being the next vice presidential nominee. It got leaked that she was asked to be vetted to potentially be one of Biden's VP picks. It doesn't say much. Obviously, usually like 3 or 4 people get vetted, so she's obviously on the short list. Do you think there's any legitimacy or chance that she is the VP pick at the end of the day?
Tim Kaine 2.0. Hillary Clinton, she picked Tim Kaine. She knew she was going to pick Tim Kaine. Oh, man, that's a tough one. I'm going to say no, I don't buy it entirely, even though he may go that way. I mean, it depends on who Biden think he needs. I think in his head, do I need the black vote or the lefty vote? Amy Klobuchar gives him neither of those. And so I have a hard time believing that Klobuchar will be his pick. But
I don't know, Jamal, you're making the fatal mistake again. Don't do the logical thing that would make sense.
Right.
So if they need the black vote and the left vote, Amy Klobuchar is obviously the pick.
That's the person. Right. Klobuchar was radioactive to blacks in that race, every bit as much as Pete Buttigieg. I mean, prickly, overly sensitive, mean and rude to her staff. They said she's nasty to her staff. And this is the person.
Well, her whole prosecutorial background, man, I'm struggling with words today. Friday. Luckily, we have a long weekend ahead of us, but she also had the same problems with Kamala Harris when it came to her history in the justice system. That she was, not a great actor. So nobody. There was enough other things to critique her about that we didn't even get a chance to go there with her, Jamal. So there is going to be plenty more Amy Klobuchar hate around the corner if that is the pick. Jamal, we do need to put a pin in it before coming back with a few more stories we wanted to fit in before we take off for the week. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in DC. We're back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. Jamal, I want to talk to the liberals out there that may still be hanging on their relationship with Andrew Cuomo and Joe Biden. It's a long weekend ahead of us. It's time to break up with the two of the men. You got to break up with them. You have a long weekend. You can find a new boo. I know we still have to do social distancing, but it's time. You got to find some other people to lead your efforts. And if you're not quite there yet, you're saying, Bob, you just got to sell it to me one more time. Remind me one more time why I need to break up with Andrew Cuomo and Joe Biden. Let me start with Joe Biden just to pile on after the potential pick of Amy Klobuchar. There was a man, Joe Biden's foreign policy advisor, Anthony Blinken, who gave an interview with Face the Nation this week talking about Joe Biden's foreign policy. It was a wide-ranging interview, and among numerous topics, Blinken, Barack Obama's United States Deputy Secretary of State, said regarding Joe Biden's Syrian strategy, quote, "We still have a number of small and special forces in northeastern Syria. They happen to be near where very valuable resources are located. They shouldn't be there for the oil, as President Trump would have it, but they happen to be there adjacent to it. That's a point of leverage because the Syrian government would love to have dominion over those resources. We should not give that up for free." Blinken went on to say, quote, "Similarly, we have a greater capacity than any country on earth to mobilize others to help in Syria's rebuilding and reconstruction at the right time. We should make sure that if we're going to play that role, we get something for it on behalf of the Syrian people. Right now, what diplomatic processes exist? He goes on to say the U.S. is AWOL. We're not in it. The Russians are in it. The Turks are in it. The Iranians are in it. We're not. I can tell you this. I can't guarantee success. I can guarantee that the Biden administration will at least show up. Wow, Jamal. Great diplomacy at work there. We are adjacent to the resources that we can use for leverage of the Syrian government, but we aren't there for the oil like Trump. What resources are you talking about, Mr. Blinken? I'm pretty sure you're talking about the oil. And then Mr. Blinken talks about nation building. Yeah, that's reassuring given Americans' shoddy building records in the Middle East. And then ends with talking about Biden administration will make some effort to inject itself. We might not do well, but we'll be there continuing to fight our proxy battles with Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And this is who people want to lead the United States. Joe Biden, that's your foreign policy. It sounds like much of the same as Donald Trump's.
Yeah, it's basically Trump. That's all. I mean, and the sad part is Western media. I mean, the United States, Syria is not on the border of Oklahoma, right? I mean, we're in somebody else's country that doesn't want us there, be it Iraq or, for that matter, be it Syria. And we are stealing resources that are in Syria. And the Trump administration basically bragged about stealing the oil. That was an impeachable offense. It's illegal to go into somebody else's country and steal a particular product. However, we give that a pass. The media gives that a pass because we're exceptional, and so we're allowed to do it. And Biden, who's basically running with the exact same foreign policy as Trump. Yeah, we're going to be here to take the resources. Well, whether you steal the oil or whether you're stealing other resources, you're still stealing. Let's just be very
what
clear.
other resource? It's like it's the oil. Like that's the resource.
Right.
I mean, that's what's funny about it is like there's other resources. Like the oil. It's the oil, my guy. That's the whole point. And people need to remember that the whole Syrian quagmire. This is an issue very personal to me because I was at American University in 2010 working with a lot of Syrian nationals as well as professors that were from the region who had deep connections to the administration. And they went to USA. They went to the State Department. They went to the White House. These are people in faith communities, nonprofit communities, in the academic circles that had the connections to people that were in the region, and they said, hey, things are getting really bad there. We need to step up and intervene, and we can have basically nonviolent approaches towards reducing tensions within the region and have some type of conference outside of the area to pull out some of the regional leaders from the different factions, Jamal. And they went to each of those different agencies, and everybody said, no, we don't want to get involved. We shouldn't do meddling. And then once tension started to heighten, once there was some violence, then America's like, oh, let's get in on this. Let's show up. And for me, it just shows the United States has no interest in keeping the peace or stabilizing the region. It's all about destabilization. It's all about the resources. And nobody should forget that Joe Biden was part of the Barack Obama administration that helped continue destabilizing the Middle East. And they shouldn't think Joe Biden's administration would be any different from that.
Yeah, drone wars.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah, drone wars, exactly. Yeah, the other breakup story. I know Andrew Cuomo. You have a big crush on him. He's cute. It's great. He's made for TV. His dad's a great legacy. His brother Chris, great guy on CNN. I know. But let me tell you this story, and then you tell me if you shouldn't break up with him. An AP story from this morning reports that more than 4,300 recovering coronavirus patients were sent to New York's already vulnerable nursing homes in the midst of the outbreak there. This was done under a March 25th state directive, and that directive wasn't scrapped until May 10th. When people thought, maybe this isn't just accelerating the nation's deadliest outbreaks. AP had to do its own tally of patients because New York's health department hasn't released its own internal survey from 2 weeks ago. It says it's still verifying data. Wow. Andrew Cuomo himself was the main driver of the policy and continues to defend it, saying that the homes could have simply refused to take COVID-19 patients. The directive, however, said, quote, no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to the nursing home solely based on confirmed or suspected COVID-19, and didn't modify that language until a month later. Wow. Many relatives of the people in the homes were furious, and the people scrambled to make other plans. An executive with the Society for Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Medicine said, quote, the effect of that order was to contribute to 5,000 deaths. Jamal, yeah, wow.
Wow. Cuomo said he sleeps at night because he hasn't, lost any lives that they could have saved. These
5,
statements. And Trump said something similar. I'm always amazed at how close Republicans and Democrats are in the way that they come up with their policies. I mean, the Democrats may say we're going to drop humanitarian bombs that are going to turn into flowers when it hits a good person, but it's going to be a bomb when it hits a bad person. And Trump makes his argument, we've done nothing wrong. Republicans will go into these countries just to show force but they're still going into the countries. I mean, whether Joe Biden is arguing, well, we're not going to steal the oil, we're just going to steal other resources, or Trump arguing, we're just going to steal the oil, those things are effectively the same. Like this foreign policy, as if these are two different wings or two different parties, not so much. And Cuomo, this is disturbing. I mean, we're talking about a situation where thousands lost their lives. I mean, the nursing homes were rampant in regards to the amount of people that were being ill and sick with COVID. And all of these people are susceptible to it that much more because of age and other infirmities. Cuomo is directly responsible for thousands of people who lost their lives out of sheer incompetence. Yeah, this is disturbing, Bob.
Yeah, I'm not laughing there at what you just said, but I was laughing at. Remember when the liberals thought their solution to the Biden problem was to replace him with Andrew Cuomo?
Yeah, right. They kept asking.
Funny times. A good place to end on a lighthearted laugh there at you good old liberals. Thank you for listening, Political Misfits. I know you're not the red or the blue, so thank you for being with us. Big thank you to our guests today, Guy McPherson and Steve Grumbine. Thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us up and going. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty, as always. On behalf of Jamarl Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, I appreciate you guys showing up. We actually had a really good segment today. We've ended up, I think I saw 2 something here. I was talking to, well, not talking to, but I saw Mike on the channel the other day, Mike Figueroa, Humanist Report. And he said they've lost 55% of their support base, meaning 55% of the people basically dropped off. I couldn't tell what was going on with that. Initially, we started off with like 400 or more people. Sometimes I think the most we hit 5 something live. And after we started doing the radio show at home, then those numbers dropped. But apparently that's something that's happening almost across the board. So I don't necessarily know. I suppose it's just a difference in schedules. Wesley Walker, as always. Thank you, Wesley. I appreciate it, man. Don't forget thumbs up. That's right. Give us a like. Give us a share. And of course, thank you for joining us. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.